Good morning, everyone, and thank you for participating in what promises to be an engaging program developed in conjunction with our colleagues in the Science, Technology, Innovation Program, the Serious Games Initiative, and the Environmental Change and Security Program. My name is Jack Durkee, and I am the Program Assistant for the Polar Initiative. I work with Mike Sfraga, the Director of the Polar Initiative, and he is unable to be here today. The Arctic has emerged as an important, contemporary, and ever-evolving issue. As we know, the Arctic landscape is changing quickly with myriad political, social, economic, and environmental implications. We are pleased to partner with the Serious Games Initiative to bring to you insight into the innovative ways in which communicating environmental science in Alaska is taking place. I'm also pleased to note that these two programs are exploring, with partners, the eventual development of a serious game focused on changing the landscape in Alaska. I'm sure Dr. Newberry will share her thoughts on this effort throughout the presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Newsbury to introduce the panel and to facilitate today's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you all so much for coming today, and I'm so happy to see so many people who've come out to see us, and also people coming in from Alaska to participate. I'm Elizabeth Newberry. I'm the director of the Serious Games Initiative here at the Wilson Center. One of our program initiatives is to focus on the public communication of science, and so we put this panel together with the Polar Initiative to talk about Arctic science and how we can engage the public more aptly in issues ranging from ice to oceans to everything else that's happening up in Alaska. Without further ado, I'm just going to let you know we're going in the order that we're seated here, even virtually seated here. We'll have Dr. Stephanie Fearman from Barnard College go first, talking about my personal favorite, no offense to everyone else, but the gaming initiatives that she's working on there. And then we'll have Dr. Jeremy Mathis coming on talking about ocean and salinity. And then we'll have Erin and Karen, who's a voice from the beyond at the moment. And they will be talking about their initiatives from a ground-up approach to science engagement around different issues in Alaska, part of the Adapt Alaska project. So, without further ado, I'll pass it over to Stephanie.
Great, thank you very much, Liz. So I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about using games and other novel educational approaches to engage people in understanding and climate change, understanding the changes that we're seeing in the Arctic region, and understanding also what they can do about that. So I'm the lead on a project called the Polar Learning and Responding Climate Change Education Partnership, and this is funded by the National Science Foundation. And you can see that we have a large number of partners, including people at academic institutions, including people in Alaska, also people at informal education institutions, and then some businesses and some practitioners as well. We've been working together over 7 years to develop and then implement some novel educational approaches, and I'll be sharing 2 examples of those with you today. The approach we're taking is to create a portfolio and then to test and evaluate what works and what doesn't work, and basically how they're working as well. So the content ranges from science-based to more connecting with society. The goals range from raising awareness to actually informing decisions. The approaches range from low-tech to high-tech, and I'll be focusing on the low-tech ones here today. And the venues range from classrooms to public spaces. We're trying to reach adults, including teachers, and through them reaching others, for example, school kids in classrooms. One of the reasons why we're focusing on adults is because there's been a lot of concerted efforts on how to change things in the schools, how to engage people through specific classroom exercises, but only 1 in 5 people is in a classroom. So this informal education setting we think is really important to address as well. So one of our communication goals is to manage multiple stakeholder priorities. When you think of the changing Arctic, your head spins. There's so many people, from the coastal communities to the businesses to the environment itself. How can we keep straight, what's happening and who's it happening to? And so what we've done is we've worked with Larry Hamilton on some survey research, and this was interesting. He asked people, which territory has thousands of people? Our country with territory that has thousands of people living north of the Arctic Circle, and only 18% of people said the US. A lot of people thought it was a trick question, and they answered none, when in fact, that is indeed the case. There's thousands of people in Alaska that live north of the Arctic Circle. We then asked people, should oil and gas development or ecosystems be an Arctic priority? And what people overwhelmingly said was ecosystems. And when you think of the people living and working in the Arctic, of course there's other priorities that have to be brought to bear as well. And so what we did was we developed a role-playing game where the goal for people was to create a marine management plan around 2040 that involved all stakeholders. We gave them the role that they were supposed to create this management plan. And if you're interested in this, you can actually download all the background materials on the project so that you can actually run this yourselves. It's been exciting for us that, as far as we know, everyone who's tried this either in a facilitated setting, either in a classroom or with the public, has actually used it again. So the way that this works is that there's 6 roles: coastal communities, oil and gas, fisheries, tourism, environmental advocates, and shipping. Each role player, you can play in teams or as a single person, has a 1-page description, very, very straightforward and easy to understand, and 2 maps, the present distribution and then the distribution at around 2040 or so. They're each allowed to make 3 claims each, and this is interesting. They put their hand on a big map and they actually circle it, and they say, these are my 3 high priority areas. And by getting them to, this gesturing is really important. Research has shown this, that they actually, at first they don't want to make a mark, and then when we say, no, you have to identify 3 areas that are the highest priority to you, they then are in essence taking responsibility for their choice. And that's really important. After they identify these, the next task is that they have to reconcile the claims. So they have to go through and they have to talk about what it is why they established this area as a priority and what their interests were in it. And then they try to balance all the different claims or different priorities. And we use the Harvard negotiation strategy called Getting to Yes, which sounds kind of funny, but I had actually heard a Norwegian diplomat talk about the way that he was able to resolve, together with the Russians, a decades-long territorial dispute in the Barents Sea using exactly that approach. And so this is actually replicating, to some degree, reality. After they state their claims and they come up with a plan, we then have a crisis, and often it's an oil spill. And we say, okay, now, given this crisis, how would you adjust, your plan? And what's really interesting after this, and we've run this with people from 10th grade all the way up to graduate law school students at Columbia, as well as the general public. And what they say is that the power of the spatial representation is just extraordinary. They understand, what the different priorities are. They gain some empathy and some awareness of why other stakeholders have different concerns than they do. And when we ask them how they feel about the changing Arctic after playing this exercise, this simulation, they say they have a new appreciation for all stakeholder concerns, and they're left hopeful and optimistic that some resolution can be made if we can get everybody to the table and talk about this. Another project that we have is focusing on the Arctic marine ecosystem, and sometimes it's kind of fun to actually play the Arctic Smartic. Actually, so we call it Arctic Smartic, Strategic Management of Resources in Times of Change. And also it sounds good together. We played that both in the Arctic and we played it in the Antarctic as well. And when we played that game in the Antarctic, it was interesting because the people, it was on a tourist cruise, and they wanted more than an hour and a half to play the game. They wanted to take their roll sheets home with them, and they said that they wished that they had played the game before the beginning of the cruise, or on the first part of it, because it was so helpful in understanding the territories that they were navigating. So moving on to talk about the Arctic ecosystem. When people Google, global warming, the picture of the polar bear comes up. So our interest here was to say, okay, how do we explain to people? How do we engage people in understanding that, the changing Arctic is not just about polar bears? And so, there's humans who are part of the problem and part of the solution, and that there's cascading impacts along the entire food web. So what better way to do it than actually give people the responsibility to create a food web? So they actually construct this food web from the ground up. In this case, it's from the ice up, and they draw cards that are various parts of the ecosystem, and they match them up in predator versus prey relationships. What happens next is that, and I'll show you an example of this here. So the startup is are sea ice cards, ice algae, and ice copepod that are feeding on the ice algae. Then you would potentially draw Arctic cod, and you would place that as the predator for the prey, which is the ice copepod. You might then draw a ring seal, and you would place that on top. Now what's interesting is you see the little white icons in the bottom right there. Those are the required sea ice icons, and the ring seal, because they have habitat requirements associated with sea ice, actually need 2 ice cards. And with the polar bear, they actually need 3. So this gives a sense about the requirements for sea ice. Now, of course, this is not just happening, without any changes. So when they draw a card that is associated with carbon pollution, what happens then is that they have to melt the ice. And what's really fun is actually they flip the ice over, and it's ocean on the other side. And at that point, you have to melt 2 of the ice cards, and so the polar bear and the seal are no longer have the ice that they need in order to support their requirements for habitat and also for hunting, and so they have to migrate, and so they migrate to another player, and if they have appropriate habitat, then they'll be able to stay there, and if they don't have appropriate habitat, then they're out of the game. Now, of course, you can actually bring ice back as well, and you can do that by taking action to reduce warming. And so this is one way that you can bring the ice back. What we've done is we've analyzed the outcomes from this, the player interaction with the game, and this was really interesting because we were saying, what is a good control for this setup? And we thought, well, something like a National Geographic style article might be something that the general public would be reading instead of playing a game, and so we tuned an article that I had written for something else to have the content that the game has. And we randomly assigned people to either play the game or to read the article. And we first did a pre-survey to just find out, we asked them questions along the lines of, what comes to mind when you think of Arctic species or Arctic animals? And then we had them either read the article or play the game. We then did a post-survey. And then what was really neat in this case, and I recommend this to everybody, is we did a follow-up survey. So 4 weeks later, we did another survey. We had 41 participants with 21 reading and then 20 playing the game. And what we found, which was really neat, was that the game was equally good as the article in teaching content knowledge immediately after gameplay. So this is actually quite extraordinary because people had to learn to play the rules of an unfamiliar game. And even so, they learned as much content from playing the game as from reading the article. And you can see here that the immediate response to the first question, what comes to mind when you think of Arctic animals, was polar bears, seals, and penguins, which there aren't penguins in the Arctic. But when we did the post-survey, penguins are gone, which is interesting. And we have the base of we asked them this time, what is it that you learned new from playing the game or reading the article? And you see the base of the food web. It's phytoplankton, fish, algae, and humans are also part of the system as well. We then, with the 4-week follow-up, those are the two at the top are the ones I just showed to you. The 2 at the bottom are the 4-week follow-up. In the game, you can just see the colors are almost identical. So the learning was sticky. So people 4 weeks later said, yeah, what I learned from playing the game was about the base of the food web. Whereas the ones who read the article reverted back to polar bears and seals. So they reverted back to their pre-existing knowledge. And so the learning was not as sticky when they played the game, when they read the article. So this is, I think, really interesting for educators, both in formal and informal settings, is that engaging some kind of novel educational approach, when it's well constructed, can actually promote better learning than the standard approach. Another thing was that the game increased the perception of knowledge. And when people feel, and clearly they did wind up learning more, but this was immediate post survey. And so this was not the long-term follow-up. So even immediately afterwards, people had the sense when they played the game that they had learned more, and they had an increased sense of agency. So they felt that there was more that they can do. And we think that this might have come about because people were playing those action cards. So they actually, when they read about the changes in the Arctic and what you could do about it, they weren't actually taking any action. The gestures weren't involved, and they weren't involved in the cause and effect. But when they played the game, they actually saw this, that they could take the action and then the ice would come back. And this goes to the next graph too, where the game would maintain people's interest. They felt it was fun to play. They lost track of time. It made them happy. Whereas the article at the bottom made them feel angry. So they actually felt frustrated, we think, that they were learning about these problems in the Arctic and there wasn't anything that they could do about them. So we think that the idea of using these novel educational approaches where you have the opportunity for people to engage in responses are really interesting ways to engage people in understanding Arctic science and the Arctic changes. And we've brought this out to the general public in a couple of different ways, and one of them was through an Arctic game jam that we held. We've also done climate game jams, but they're really fun. You can run them in anything from, say, 3 hours to a day and a half or even longer, and there's a how-to guide about how to create a game jam on your own. What you do when you're asking people to come together in teams to create games is you're actually moving up very quickly through Bloom's taxonomy. So you're going very quickly from having the content information, gathering that, so the remembering and understanding, to the applying to the situation of the game, all the way up to evaluating and then creating, where you have the creation of the game at the end. And so our survey results show that people learn a tremendous amount about the content knowledge as well as have fun making the games. And this is just one of the games that I wanted to share with you. This was developed by Pearl River High School in New York, and it's an Arctic Twister game where the twister plates are sea ice. And you can see that it would fit very neatly, with the already known rules for how to play Twister. So in conclusion, I think it's really important when we think about Arctic communication is to pair message with media. So you can, if you target identified education gaps, and we did this through survey research, and then you use the games and simulations to engage people in problem solving, and then these novel educational approaches become tremendous conversation starters. And through that, I think we'll be engaging people and talking with friends and family, which are so important. Research actually shows that friends and family are second only to scientists in terms of being trusted sources of education, of science, Arctic science. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I think this is a great example, and we'll talk more about it in the Q&A, but of how we can take science and really translate it into an accessible and engaging public medium. And I think one of the next things that we'll be talking about with Jeremy's work is how we can think of not just getting science to the public, but how we need to really rethink science in order to have that sort of action initiative that you were highlighting as well. So Jeremy, if you wouldn't mind.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming, and for everybody that's online. I want to thank Liz and Mike and Jack, everybody who put this on. I think this is extremely timely to be having this conversation about the Arctic. And so I want to take my few minutes this morning to tell you a little bit of a story about a very young, very naive assistant professor who showed up in Fairbanks, Alaska a few years ago and started working on something that it was at the time a really emerging topic. Nobody had ever heard of what was called ocean acidification before. It was just really starting to be discovered out in the ocean, and we didn't quite understand what we had. But the science of it evolved so quickly, so much faster than really anything ever had before in terms of the way that it related to human impacts, that it got out in front of us. And we forgot that we needed to be engaging the stakeholders and communicating with the public as we started talking about the science that was going on with what we were doing in our labs and out in our field programs. And I was probably one of the worst offenders of that, because we were going out and we were making these measurements around ocean acidification, which is just simply the changing of ocean chemistry due to how much carbon dioxide is in the water. And we quickly figured out that it had a real potential to start harming organisms in the ocean, everything from tiny little free-swimming zooplankton all the way up to red king crab that were an important part of the Bering Sea. And because it had such a dynamic impact and because it captured the attention of the media so quickly, it began to get a lot of press coverage. So all we had to do was say something like, my findings may impact this species, or my findings may require us to rethink how we're managing a fishery somewhere. That would get picked up in the media and would just go viral. And the fishermen and the communities around Alaska, the public who were relying on the fishing and the livelihoods that it provided with them, were not part of the conversation. We didn't stop and engage the public at those initial stages before we started going out and talking in very broad terms about ocean acidification. And I think we did ourselves a great disservice by doing that. We alienated a large part of the stakeholder community that we should have been working with and relying on to help carry our message and help understand what was going on. And because of that, they became very averse to the things that we were saying. They didn't want to hear about it. They didn't want to understand it. They saw it as just another ploy or another attempt from the science community to start encroaching on their livelihoods and the economies that they were relying on. And so I think we can carry that forward into our discussion now about the Arctic. Is we're sitting here in Washington, D.C., talking a lot about everything that's happening in the Arctic and the changes that are happening in the Arctic and everything we need to do to respond to the Arctic, and we're not doing a good enough job of communicating that to the public yet. We're missing the boat in terms of bringing on the stakeholders, particularly for the communities outside of Alaska, as we need to have a national conversation to show everybody in America, not just people who go to the Arctic or who work in the Arctic, the impacts that this could have. And that's what we ultimately started doing with ocean acidification. We started broadening it out and thinking about the fact that things like ocean acidification may threaten protein from more than 1 billion people who rely exclusively on the ocean to provide the dominant source of the protein in their diet. And we started looking at these global trends when it came to ocean acidification and putting in this context where a much larger group of people would start to understand and appreciate it. We recognized very early on that it was human emissions of carbon dioxide that were driving ocean acidification and causing it to occur. And so we started looking at those trends and seeing that energy consumption around the planet was going to start going up significantly, and still is, which was going to mean more release of CO2, which was going to lead to more ocean acidification. That the worldwide consumption of seafood was going to triple by 2030, putting even more pressure on the ocean and the communities that were relying on it. Another statistic that's really striking is the fact that 3 billion people currently live within 200 kilometers of the coast, but in the next 10 years or so, we expect that number to double, that more people are going to move into the coastal regions and put even more pressure on these marine species that we're relying on. And then finally, we started bringing this back to Alaska and thinking about how that was going to impact the populations that were co-located in these places where the communities were relying heavily on the ocean, but we also saw in those places that's where ocean acidification was really starting to occur. And so we reached out far too late. We were 5 or 6 years into this process in Alaska by the time we got around to doing this, of engaging the public as to what they thought and what their perceptions were about ocean acidification. And we found some pretty striking statistics when we did this survey. We surveyed 1,000 people around the state of Alaska, and we found some things that we knew pretty well, that somewhere between 30 and about 46% of the population in Alaska relied solely on seafood as their primary source of protein in their diet. We found some good news that by that point, Alaskans were 3 times more aware that ocean acidification was going on than residents down in the lower 48. But then we found some concerning statistics, things like only 28% of the respondents recognized that ocean acidification was going to probably disproportionately affect Alaska, probably in the short term. So we immediately sort of reversed course and started doing real concerted outreach into the communities. We spanned out as much as we possibly could around the state, and we started engaging those very stakeholders who had really turned against us, unfortunately, in this work that we were doing. And we started communicating better about the impacts that this could potentially have. Things like the fact that the Bering Sea produces 62% of all the fish that are caught in the United States, and that the need to not sort of start doing policy management in the Bering Sea based on this, but the urgent need to actually collect the information and understand the information that we needed to in order to make good policy when it came to this extremely important fishery in the Bering Sea. And so as we engaged more and more, we recognized that we had to come up with some kind of risk assessment for the state, a risk assessment that would incorporate all the people, not just the science community, but the actual individuals who were living around the state of Alaska and how they were going to be potentially impacted and some of the things that they could start to do to mitigate the risk that they were facing. And so we developed this model framework of all these components of how we assessed risk when it came to ocean acidification in the state of Alaska, with this ocean acidification, this hazard component of it right here, being actually only 1/3 of the driver of what the risk was. The other major components was the exposure, how much a community was going to be exposed to ocean acidification over the next decade. And then the biggest piece was their vulnerability to that. And vulnerability included everything like size of the economy in certain regions, the industrial diversity, the income of individuals, the food accessibility, and their educational attainment opportunities. And when we plugged all that in, we were able to develop a very robust risk assessment for the state of Alaska when it came to ocean acidification. And so on here, the reds and the yellows were places where there was high to moderate risk of ocean acidification impacting these communities, and the blue areas were places that had relatively lower risk. So we did this with the sole intention of bringing information to the community and communicating it to them in a way that they could start to plan and start to understand the decision-making process that they needed to adapt in order to deal with the challenge, in this case being a very acute driver like ocean acidification. But then we started recognizing that we could apply this to other areas, and this is when we started pivoting to the Arctic. And we recognized that we could apply this same concept on a much broader scale in the Arctic, and in the way that the Arctic's changing and the way that it's impacting the communities, not just in Alaska and not just in the Pan-Arctic itself, but the entire population of the Northern Hemisphere, the entire sort of global development and global implications of what a changing Arctic was going to do. And so as part of the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, IARPC, we developed an environmental intelligence group that was working to begin to understand and engage and communicate with the challenges that were starting to happen in the Arctic. And we developed this environmental intelligence cycle that we can start going through now in order to do just what we did for ocean acidification in the state of Alaska. We can now apply this environmental intelligence cycle to all of the challenges and all of the problems and even the opportunities that are starting to emerge in the Arctic. And starting first and foremost with decision support. Before we do anything, we need to think about the communities that we're serving, the decision makers that we're responding to, and ultimately the questions that need to be answered. And then we move from that step into translating our objective data into functional evidence, taking a look at what we have in hand today, not going out and recreating data or recreating new studies that have already been done, actually mining and effectively using the data that we have at our disposal and integrating it effectively to build what we were referring to as functional evidence. Once we've done that, then we take a comprehensive look at that level of knowledge that we have, and we use our observational capacities just to fill the gaps that are necessary to answer our ultimate question. We then use those observations, once we have the complete picture, to validate the system-level models for the Arctic that are ultimately telling us what's going to go on at a pan-Arctic scale, and hopefully the connections that the Arctic change is going to have down into the processes and the weather and the things that we're dealing with down here, not just in the lower 48, but around the northern hemisphere. And once we do that, we go back and assess how responsive we were to our ultimate question. Once we've gone through our 3 steps, we say, by this data that we've integrated, the new observations we've made, our modeling efforts, have we been able to answer the question? Have we been able to solve the problem that the decision makers actually needed us to solve? And if the answer is no, then we step back into the cycle again and we do it again until we do. If the answer is yes, then we're able to efficiently move on to the next problem. And so I'm pretty confident that using this sort of simplistic model in our thinking and in our approach to problem solving can really help us start to make some progress when it comes to dealing with the challenges in the Arctic and communicating that information that we find very effectively to the public. And that's ultimately what we ended up with ocean acidification when we applied this same framework. We were not only able to understand the direct effects of ocean acidification and start to build out the knowledge base for how it's impacting species and communities and everything that's going on in the state of Alaska, we're able to tie that into the much broader picture of the larger piece of the system level puzzle that was so perplexing to us before we were able to do that. So I think the Arctic is going to be a bigger challenge, but we have to approach it from the same risk assessment standpoint, because people do understand risk. We had a meeting here yesterday where we were talking about Arctic infrastructure and the need to develop Arctic infrastructure and the risk that are associated with us, the United States, or us as a North America, or us as a global Arctic community, not developing the infrastructure that we need to respond to the changes that are happening in the Arctic. So I think we can use this model, and as I said, I think this forum is particularly timely to start thinking about ways to really engage the stakeholders and engage the people that are going to be living and working in the Arctic, and not focusing too much on our little space here in Washington, D.C., where we lose sight of where the real impacts are landing, which is out in the world where people are having to deal with these changes in real time. So I'll stop there and we move on.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to turn the screen off for a second because I have to download a PowerPoint that was sent from Alaska.
Excellent. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, if you would take a moment to introduce yourself while I get us all set up down here, Aaron.
Great, I will do that. Yeah, and apologies, I can't be there this morning. I'd much rather be sitting next to Stephanie and Jeremy rather than looming over them on the Jumbotron there. And apologies for swilling coffee furiously in the background while you guys were talking, but it's a little early here still. So my name is Aaron Poe, and I work for an environmental organization called the Alaska Conservation Foundation. But basically my position with them is as the coordinator for the Aleutian and Bering Sea Islands Landscape Conservation Cooperative. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit of the work that we've been doing, and I'll get into a little bit more of what that means, Landscape Conservation Cooperative, here as the slides come up. But I think my colleague Karen Pletnikoff is maybe on the phone. Karen, do you want to chime in?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Pletnikoff, the Community Environment and Safety Manager for the Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association. We're the regional native nonprofit of the 13 Aleut tribes, and I provide environmental technical assistance to our tribal programs. I have a slide coming up too, so I'll say
You
more
do?
Thanks.
I'll be your Vanna
And
White.
I
1
do
second.
too. And it looks like I can see us on, or I can see the PowerPoint on the screen there behind you guys. So it looks like we can dive right into that second slide. So landscape conservation cooperatives, or LCCs, I'm not sure if folks in the room maybe have heard of these, but essentially they're public-private partnerships, and they're focused on conservation efforts, and specifically focused on trying to tackle conservation on large-scale issues. So things like climate change, things like ocean acidification, things like vessel traffic, for example, or these big issues that many different entities are trying to grapple with. They were largely funded by the Fish and Wildlife Service, starting about 2010 or so. But say in Alaska have been able to attract, over 100, probably 130, maybe even 150 different partner organizations at this point. That includes agencies, that includes tribes, that includes NGOs, universities, a variety of different entities working in partnership. And this map that you see on the screen here has the kind of the geography of the 5 LCCs in Alaska. You can see, and the one that I am with is that Aleutian and Bering Sea Islands, the one in yellow. So far west, we're almost east. Yeah, go ahead and do the next slide there, Elizabeth, or Karen. So Karen, we've got your Aleutian, your APIA slide.
Like I said, we're the regional native nonprofit for the 13 Aleut tribes. We provide everything from direct medical care to vocational assistance, public safety, and I work in our environmental health division alongside our senior scientist, Bruce Wright, who works on paralytic shellfish poisoning. We have a number of issues in our region, from formerly used defense sites to harmful algal blooms to local community environmental challenges like our frequently open dump system. I sit on the steering committee for the Aleutian Bering Sea Islands LCC, as well as Western Alaska Landscape Conservation Cooperative, because our region is split. It's because of these partnerships that APIA was able to have the support and partners needed to apply for BIA coastal resilience funding to host workshops in 4 areas, 4 hubs in the state, only one of which was in our region. I'm going to pass it back to Aaron now, I think, and I'll chime in as things come up. Thanks.
Okay, excellent, Karen. I'll expect quips and jabs from the sidelines there. So we want to do next slide. And basically, as Karen mentioned, that we came together in this effort. We initially launched these 4 coastal resilience workshops. The landscape conservation cooperatives had enough funding to basically reach out and do one in Nome, and Karen was successful at getting the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, funding that she mentioned, to be able to pick up 3 more. So in Unalaska, in King Salmon, and in Kotzebue. So again, those all being in Western Alaska. And then actually our partner, David Holland, with Alaska Sea Grant, was able to reach out to additional monies, again, from this time from the North Pacific LCC, so a different LCC in geography, in Alaska for Southeast, that basically was able to add a 5th to these workshops. So in total, we ended up having about 300 some individuals, 52 tribes, and I think 16 different state and federal agencies. And essentially what we were trying to do with these workshops is bring everyone together in one place to talk about the tools and resources, some of the science and data, do some of that kind of information transfer, building that environmental intelligence that Jeremy talked about. But at the same time, having those scientists and those managers that maybe produce some of those products, or are trying to get people to use those products, actually hear from community leaders, as if those products were useful. I think a lot of times scientists imagine that, if we create this awesome GIS data set that looks at shoreline erosion, people will be able to immediately pick that up and start applying for funding to abate those challenges maybe. And I think it's kind of an assumption that doesn't pan out often. So really what we were trying to deliberately develop in this was sort of an effort to create that information exchange. Next slide. And so you can kind of see I won't read it to you, but sort of the mission of the effort here really was just trying to create this information exchange. And again, the initial focus being those 4 workshops. The only way that this would have been able, we would have been able to pull something like this off to get those numbers of people in the room from those diverse different entities was with all the local help. So of course I have kind of like the refrigerator magnet display of all the logos from the different groups that were involved. And it's probably not even inclusive of everyone that had a hand in making this go. In order to organize a 2-day workshop, in these kind of hub locations, these remote areas, it takes a lot of footwork on the ground to really get the right people in the room. And so we owe a huge debt to those folks. Next slide. And so what are the products that came out of this? And again, this was kind of the initial conception is, oh, we're going to try and pull all this kind of tools, information, data together that could be useful to communities, could be useful to managers, whether it's a wildlife refuge or a park or even sort of a city manager, for example, that some of these pieces of information or some of these programs that are out there available to them could be useful. And again, I think as we went into it, though, we recognize that there's people that are already doing things. There's local communities or tribes or whomever that are already, making efforts. They're making these kind of adaptation changes. And it'd be great if those folks could be sharing their stories with their peers throughout that kind of Western Alaska geography. And so it ended up having a kind of this case study from coastal communities, things folks are already doing, as well as some of the GIS and data sets and whatnot that could describe some of the changes that are likely to happen. Next slide. And I think, in terms of maybe a unique communication aspect of this effort, besides that sort of really collaborative two-way exchange, this piece of it, this posters aspect was kind of a unique, sort of way to talk about and try to share with others perspectives on climate change. So you see these folks gathered around this table. We basically came in with a draft poster set of here's what, sort of scientists and managers and, frankly, kind of people from Anchorage, maybe not from that rural part of the state, think is important to talk about climate change. So we had this very drafty looking poster and basically set that on the table and did this in a series of rounds. So you'd have like 6 or so groups going at a time and asking them, well, here's what we think you might say about climate change in this region, but what are we missing? What are the important stories that you want to see represented in a poster that's trying to tell a story about what's happening in this geography? And so this was a really neat process. And, by the end of it, you basically have kind of a product with about 200 co-authors, from those diverse entities that we were able to bring to this workshop. And so I'll just kind of if you go to the next slide, you see an example of this there was a poster set of 3. And by the way, quick promo, we have these poster sets available and I could work with Liz to get them to anybody who's interested. But basically, this one was focused on sort of talking about the ocean and the dependence of communities on the ocean and how the oceans are changing as a result of climate change. And so it ended up, again, being this kind of collaborative process to develop it. And in the end, has kind of a neat graphical, but also, sort of tells the sciencey aspects and some of the personal stories or some of the kind of quotes from folks in that poster. If you do the next slide, I'll just show you another example. Again, I said it's a set of 3. I'm only going to show you here 2. But this one was talking about the subsistence lifestyle. So for folks maybe not familiar with Alaska, there's a number of the communities that, basically their cultural vitality, in addition to their literal kind of food resources, comes from these natural systems, comes from hunting, comes from fishing, comes from harvesting from the land. And so in this particular poster, we try to convey that. And this is one of the challenges I know that rural folks constantly tell us is that people don't understand the importance of subsistence to these rural communities. And so this poster kind of tries to graphically show that, as well as some of the changes. But then in there, there's a bunch of different quotes from folks who participated in our workshop talking about that. And I think if you jump to that next slide, this is just trying to show, again, some of the different, we went into this with one thing in mind in terms of, we're going to be kind of doing this information exchange, we're developing these posters. But what we didn't really realize is that there would be a bunch of conversations that got started in these rooms that ultimately turn into actions or groups that are now working on these topics. So for example, if you look at the center of the screen there, there's kind of the Bering Sea and Alaska and Russia there on the left side, but that skipper science right over the top of the Pribilof Islands, that was a topic that came up in the meeting that we had in Unalaska in the Aleutians, where basically folks in the room that were skippers, commercial fishing folks, said that, hey, we are out on the water and we have been for, couple generations, 20 years, 30 years. We see a lot of things out there. Is there ways that we could be, collecting data, contributing information that then is useful to managers? And so this concept came up and was actually A pilot of it was done in 2017, the year after we did these workshops. So things like that, things like this tribal climate science liaison position. I don't know, Karen, do you want to say a little bit about Melinda's work?
Yeah, so backing up, I'd also like to point out that the posters were an effort for co-production as a way of conveying information from both scientists and community members to try and tell both sides of the same story of change in our coastal villages. I think it was also unique, not just the iterative approach that took into account more and more folks' concerns or the changes they are seeing, but also gave those agency staff who reside in our rural communities a chance to interact with their neighbors in a slightly different way, where it wasn't simply just them having a meeting to fulfill a comment period or because they've got a problematic issue to solve, but in a way that they could work to establish those relationships that create so much more opportunity to thoroughly hear each other and to look at new ways of addressing our issues. So that's just a little bit about the approach for the workshops and the posters themselves that I think are important to highlight. Again, APIA is not in the business of doing statewide work in general, but because of our partnerships and because of the success of the workshops and expressed interest in seeing this kind of coastal resilience and adaptation effort go forward, we took on the proposal to BIA for a statewide position for all 229 Alaskan tribes as the Tribal Climate Science Liaison. We just call her Tribal Liaison. She is from Anvik originally, which is regionally considered part of the YK, but it is the Nairi Nation's peoples. She's positioned in Fairbanks at the Alaska, formerly Climate Science Center, now Adaptation Center. They also have an office here in Anchorage. What's important about that is the opportunities she's had to interact with a lot of the efforts based out of UAF, our larger university, and to be able to interact with the many different activities and outreach efforts for adaptation planning, with the long-term goal of getting climate science considerations into our planning and adaptation efforts into the future. This is particularly exciting because our tribal liaison has a background in education and working with the youth, which is something that brought us here to get engaged with the gaming work that you guys are doing. So I'll pass it back to Erin at this point. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. You can do the next slide, Elizabeth. So leaving a little bit of kind of the Western Alaska, the Arctic proper behind, I did mention that a kind of a fifth workshop was spawned as a result of this. And this was an effort in Southeast Alaska, spearheaded by Dave and Holland with Alaska Sea Grant, Tlingit Haida, Central Council, and the Sitka tribe. And basically, it took advantage of a gathering of Alaska Native groups that meet every fall to talk about sort of environmental issues that they're working on. And this basically was able to turn this workshop into a planning situation. If you hit the next slide, you can see some of the things that basically the tribes, recognizing they have these interests in common, are now in talks of doing collaborative community-based monitoring, such that the tribes in that region would then all be collecting similar types of data to help get a regional perspective of what's going on in terms of climate change in that region. We do the next slide. So with these, kind of the original 4 workshops and then this additional one in Southeast, we recognize that there was a lot of conversation, a lot of stories, a lot of content that really we needed to find a way to get this out to a broader audience, not only in Alaska, but again, as far as you guys there in DC. We talked about this as an Adapt Alaska sort of community of folks. Basically, this group that recognized that there was a need to really build stronger connections between researchers, managers, tribes, and community leaders that are all basically working on maybe some different pieces of adapting to climate change. And so this effort is currently kind of led by this dozen or so different folks, including folks from NOAA and folks from Alaska Ocean Observing System, that basically help to move this movement along. If you do the next slide. So basically we had kind of three goals with this in mind. We really wanted to build better access to practical climate change information, and really trying to find ways that across these different groups working, whether it's communities, agencies, researchers, tribes, that there's more sort of collaboration and basically increased capacity as a result of that. And really trying to pull together sort of a web of partners who could begin working on some of these resilience strategies. So if you do the next page, this, again, this kind of movement has to have a website, right, they say. And so we have adaptalaska.org, which you can go to. At least this is a version 1.0 of it. It's still a work in progress. And basically it was launched and basically tries to share a number of these different stories about adaptation efforts that maybe communities themselves are taking, or different tools, different resources, different funding programs that maybe are out there to help folks move along. What we're really hoping it can become is more of an interactive space where folks are able to share their successes or reach out to their peers and colleagues that may be working on similar issues. And that's kind of like the 2.0 version that we're in the process of building right now. So if you do the next slide, this just kind of gives you a graphical look at the interface. It has this kind of iconography to talk about some of the different threats, and you can basically sort through categories of stories, resources, and tools. If you do the next slide, gives you an example. I did mention one of the issues that is really connected to climate change in Alaska is shipping. So large vessel traffic, whether it's in support of kind of exploration and development for things like oil and gas resources, or whether it's literally international shipping. Some of the largest shipping lanes in the world run through super remote places of Alaska. So this is a story about a group, another Alaska Native regional organization like Karen's called COERIC, that's based in Nome, and how they've been convening a group of tribal leaders to talk about their concerns and what sort of actions they want to take to address changes with Arctic shipping. So it shares their story. Do the next slide. One of the key things we heard about a lot in these workshops was sort of food security being an issue for a lot of these communities. And so there's a couple different stories on there about communities kind of taking kind of their own action to figure out different ways to grow healthy foods that are in their communities, or trying to work collaboratively with agencies, with researchers to manage species like this caribou that you see there in the other slide. If you do next, so, again, the website alone will not change the world. I think somebody's probably said that. If not, I just did. A couple of efforts that, are sort of parallel to this website is we have a couple of different working groups. One of the key topics that came up in our workshops was frustration with the myriad different sort of processes that have to come together magically in order for people to make progress sometimes on adaptation planning. Things like moving a community that's at risk from coastal erosion has turned out to be tremendous challenges, but even more simple aspects of trying to change maybe regulations related to subsistence harvest efforts can also prove really challenging. So people are trying to find ways to maybe streamline the approaches for adaptation so that we can make more rapid changes to address the rapid changes that we're seeing in the environment. Another key topic that came up again and again was this, and Karen alluded to it, sort of this co-production idea. Like, we think that these posters are an example of that, but basically trying to figure out a way to connect the traditional ecological knowledge or the indigenous knowledge of communities that have evolved in these areas for millennia with sort of the scientific approach. And so trying to find ways that you're leveraging the best from those two different knowledge sources to really improve adaptation efforts. So that's kind of two working groups, and that's a conversation that's continuing. We have collaboration with Alaska Sea Grant trying to synthesize a bunch of research and information needs that were surfaced in these workshops. We have a couple of future regional workshops planned. So the Yukon Delta is a huge area in far west Alaska. I think it's 56 tribes that are in pretty low-lying or coastal delta type situation, like you could even imagine sort of a Louisiana type environment, that are seeing rapid changes in their communities and around their communities and the resources they depend on. And so we have a series of workshops through the Western Alaska LCC trying to figure out adaptation strategies for those 56 tribes. And then we also have a session coming up in sort of the Kodiak area where we're trying to pull in communities from around that archipelago to have a similar type session to what we did with these coastal resilience workshops in Western Alaska. And then again, just trying to, much as we're talking to you guys this morning, trying to bring this Adapt Alaska concept to any other sort of statewide conferences that we have here. And I think we're getting close to our last slide here, Elizabeth, so if you do that, hold that next one up. These are just opportunities that, again, whenever we have the sort of the ability to reach out and talk with folks, that we think this adaptalaska.org and sort of the community around it. I think if you jump to the last slide, there should be a black slide. There we go. Basically, we have the opportunity to try and connect folks to this adaptalaska.org website, but also sort of the movement in general. We really see this could be sort of a way that stakeholders are being able to connect better on adaptation issues. We think this could be a great way that communities find a way to work with agencies, with researchers to address their challenges. And then we're also interested in seeing if there's a way that we can develop some kind of a climate change dashboard. One of the key things that we hear from folks is that, gosh, there just isn't an easy one-stop shop where I can go and get the latest information about whether it's sort of climate downscaling projections or sort of any research efforts that are talking about implications for some of the species that folks depend on. There really isn't that kind of a tool for Alaskans and for managers to access. And Karen, I think that's our last slide. I don't know if you wanted to share anything to kind of close us out.
So the idea was that I would like the group to think about several of the concepts or opportunities that have been discussed here about ways that gaming or technological platforms could be used to address some of these issues for Alaskans. The idea of a climate change dashboard, we continue to have unusual mortality events of different species. Some years it's marine mammals, some years it's seabirds, sometimes fish, and sometimes a mix. Where the hot water blob is or what current sea surface temperatures are important. But so is connecting those who have current observations as well as traditional knowledge to see the subtle changes and timing changes that are so important for understanding phases, for understanding the safety of sea ice, and to develop something where people could input information and have it quickly turned into data that they can also connect with in a visual and easy way. Our smartphone technology in our communities is actually fairly good within the community's footprint often. And so we're outside of that footprint a lot where we would make these observations, but many apps are now getting better at collecting that data and being able to seamlessly upload it or vice versa, download new data when you get back into that cellular zone. There's explicit interest from those responsible for understanding vessel traffic to develop some early warning system or some means of direct communication where those in rural Alaska can provide sightings of ships that they don't that they have concerns about, potential mystery spills, or potentially harmful interactions. Again, with our changing landscape, we are seeing things like walrus hauling out in areas where they don't typically haul out. They should be out on the ice, but with no ice, they're on land. These areas need to be able to be sent to the manager quickly so that if it's needed, For instance, to implement the Polar Code, there needs to be some mechanism to inform mariners about marine mammal interactions and ways to avoid them. And those new haul-out areas are potentially one of these issues that needs some sort of platform to quickly get from the observer to those making management decisions. And then again, with Skipper Science, there is a whole group of people who are collecting important and meaningful data every day that, like our rural hunters, could be a wonderful resource to, again, giving us that information on what the real state of things are. Because it's not just the warm water blob that results in harmful algal blooms, that results in a loss of carrying capacity and loss of forage that cascades up the trophic level and potentially results in people not getting the food they need or being exposed to food that could be potentially harmful. It's also that if we want to make any meaningful management actions, we need to know about these issues more than just, and last year's survey told us this. So I appreciate the work you guys do in the new way of looking at learning and gathering information back from people, and these opportunities here in Alaska where we have the data and we desperately need it to be applied so that we're making the right decisions. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Karen.
Great, thank you all. Thank you so much. Can we give a round of applause to our panelists, especially those that woke up at 5 in the morning to be here virtually? Thank you so much. And now I'm going to switch over to do our question and answer period, but I'm going to take the chair's prerogative of posing my own question to the panel first. And one of them is there's a consistent theme across all of your different presentations, whether it's talking about how to translate science into a gaming and engaging platform, whether it's talking about lessons on how we can reconceptualize the risk assessment in Alaska, or whether it's how we can engage and really think about from a ground up perspective how to start with communities in Alaska for sort of putting that climate conversation forward. One of the consistent themes that came up across all of your presentations was this idea of authentic engagement, of authentically engaging with multiple stakeholders and really thinking about very carefully how to reach across the aisle, from whether it's you're a scientist doing research, whether it's you're a community leader who needs this research, thinking about how to make it, to bridge that gap, how to make it relevant. And one of the things that I really wanted to dive into, though, was this idea that by doing so, all of your projects really increase the agency of the people who are using those projects. So for example, Stephanie, in your work, one of the things you highlighted was that by playing the game, people felt that they had a greater connection to the material. They felt like they were able to talk more about it. And they also, as opposed to reading an article, felt that they could really do something about it. And I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about that sort of authentic engagement as it leads to that relevancy across your different projects. And what can we do to really make sure that we are making these projects relevant to a broader public?
So maybe I could start, actually not with the card game, but with the role-playing game. So we've been really impressed with the experiences that people bring to the role-playing game. So maybe somebody has been in a business where they worked on negotiations, or they're an engineer and they've worked with something that's relevant to potentially something that's important for shipping or for oil development. And when we have them get in these groups, where they haven't met each other before, they're able to bring their whole self, their business, their professional, also their sort of social self to the table. And that is actually, it's connecting with them in an authentic way. And it allows them to see the changes in the Arctic and figure out help to construct ways to solve the problems, you know, so they get engaged in the problem solving, you know, from their other experiences. And we find that's really important because, you know, the Arctic, for most of the people who will be playing this, is far away. And they've heard of the changes there and they feel sort of helpless. And once they're able to say, oh, you know, I know this and I can bring this to the table that can help to us to have a better discussion and better negotiation, then they have that direct connection in an authentic way.
You want me to jump in on that one?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think your question about how do we engage, we have to not, or maybe get out of the habit of identifying the problems and creating the solutions here in Washington, D.C. We've got to go ask what the problems are and then look for collective solutions. And I think that's where we can do that real meaningful engagement is by not assuming that we know best here sitting in our steering committees and in our conferences that we do here, to actually go out and into the communities and spend time in those communities like Aaron has done and make sure we're getting a real fundamental level understanding of the actual problems that those folks are facing.
Thank you. Aaron?
And I would just add a little bit more to that too, Jeremy. That's a fundamental sort of that lack, and Karen probably could be more articulate about this, but it's a fundamental kind of anxiety that folks in these communities have, is that a lot of time sort of the agencies or the researchers will come into their communities and saying, hey, this is the project that I'm working on, what do you think of it? Instead of going to that community first and being like, what are the needs that you guys have that I can help you with? Like, here's the types of work that I have, here's the resources that I have. And so that kind of authentic engagement from the beginning of science questions, I think is super critical.
Yeah,
and what will lead to ultimately, you know, true co-production. I've said it too many times, but this year at AFN, the Alaska Federation of Natives Conference, Lisa Murkowski, our senator, came to us and said, climate change is real, and paused and said, climate change is real, and that we need to address it through true co-management. And along the lines of that is the concept of co-production. As Jeremy pointed out, not only is the actual question so important to have not just vetted through a rural perspective, but even the process to answer the question, the interpretation of the data that you might collect. Indigenous knowledge needs to be analyzed by the knowledge holders because of the context it's in. It's not just simply anecdotal qualitative data that we can crunch when we get enough of it, because that loses the worldview and the context of that information. And then finally, I think this might be most important, the actual solutions that will work for rural Alaska most certainly must be conceived through those who will be doing the work and living with the consequences. I would say that many of our communities' locations are the consequence of somebody else picking where people should live year-round when that wasn't the traditional way. And then we see these issues like seasonal flooding or such. So it goes all the way from the conception of the problem to the solutions. And I very much appreciate you pointing that out, Elizabeth. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I see we have some hands in the audience, so I'm going to turn it over. One thing, as the mic comes around, please say your name and where you're coming from into the mic, and speak clearly into the mic, because we do want it to be available on the live stream. So 1, 2, 3.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and all these truths are excellent, they're real, but we're living in a town that even has deniers of climate change, and all this is going on that people in, the Alaskan areas, the Arctic Circle, are living on a day-to-day basis. So what kind of best practices or methods should we be using to communicate this from some place that's very far away as far as most people's minds and existence are, in the lower 48 and other parts of the world, the reality of what's going on there, and that we need to be addressing it now and not waiting for the future. The future is now. And thank you for putting this on, Elizabeth. Very well done.
So yeah, that's a really important point. How do we bridge what's happening in Alaska to the lower 48? How do we make it relevant, and how do we make it tangible? Jeremy, I might pair it back one of your points, which is that if it's not relevant to somebody in Iowa, then it's hard to actually galvanize change down here.
Well, that's right, and that's where the risk assessment comes in. We have to look at the risk of not dealing with these challenges that are emerging in the Arctic in terms of how it's going to affect the entire country, not just the state of Alaska. And that's where we'll start to get the residents and getting people engaged and concerned. I'm teaching a class this semester at Georgetown about Arctic change, and we started talking about village relocation. And all 15 of the students in the class said, how have we never heard of this before? Our parents haven't heard of this. Nobody I know has heard of this. And they were actually upset that they hadn't, that they knew nothing about it. We've got to work harder to create that relevance and the understanding that those things that are happening in Alaska, it's not too far of a stretch to think about Louisiana and Florida and Texas and Virginia and all the other places around the coastal United States that are going to start experiencing those very same challenges in the not too distant future. And so not only is it relevant in Alaska, the solutions that we apply and the things that we can think about doing in response and building adaptation can be very relevant to the rest of the country.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This is Karen, and I'd like to add that I hear the frustration with those who are currently sitting in leadership roles that don't take seriously the issues we have. But I believe that more and more Americans do. How many millions of people just suffered 4 nor'easters in a row? I bet there's a lot of converts there. If your neighborhood's been burned and then flash flooded, I bet your attitude has changed. And if you were contaminated by your flooded city from a hurricane that's larger and providing more flooding than we've seen, I bet there's a lot of hearts changed there too. I would say what we need to do as far as bridging that gap is actually be even more direct and what's the good way you say alarmist? Because it's inappropriate, it's unfair as scientists that we fail to provide people the information on the actual worst case scenario. We know we'll come up with a new IPCC report, and we know we can measure how far off it's going to be because of our correct tendency to be conservative. But it's incorrect when the price of inaction is so high. It's appropriate to let people know how bad it very well could be and how quickly that could be. In Alaska, we're talking about the potential for the entire shape of Alaska to change because, for instance, the YK Delta, 1 or 2 feet above sea level with discontinuous permafrost and increased storminess and a lack of sea ice to protect the coastline, we could be seeing large losses there. In much of the coastal Alaska and North Slope, it's 100 to 200 feet of permafrost right next to the warming ocean waters, where a lack of sea ice creates far more erosion than we've seen in the recent past. So, and here is something like the amount of methane that was let go by Deepwater Horizon, where it was under pressure underwater and there was some hope for containment, has huge implications for how quickly warming will be happening. We'll apply that concept to the North Slope, where we have a tremendous amount of natural gas reserves that are intentionally pumped back in, waiting for a better price. But that well casing is in thawing permafrost, and we're pumping warm seawater to get better well production. And we don't know when those reservoirs could fail. We need to address this methane release in the Arctic issue before it exacerbates climate change more than it probably will. So I would say that it's actually ignoring those who will refuse to learn, because those people, if we look at the way social justice moves in the past, they just get left behind. So I don't know that they're that big of a worry. They'll just be, those racist relics of the past, for instance. Thanks.
So I also wanted to circle back to your other point about the digital platforms that are available, or we hope to make available, to sort of make the timeliness of these issues very salient to the lower 48. As Jack alluded to in the introduction, one of the initiatives we're working on here at the Wilson Center is a digital game that will make those the threatened coastal communities relevant and accessible to not just the people in Alaska, and not just using the data from Alaska, but really making it relevant down here to the lower 48. I think, as Stephanie's work demonstrates, one of the ways that games can really be used as a tool on that front is to make those sort of really complex systems really accessible to a wide variety of audiences, and adult audiences too. It's not a silver bullet, but it is in that direction. So we had 2 more questions over here.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an Intel analyst and a former diplomat. All my degrees are in oceanography. I want to ask the big picture question. These are amazing efforts you've described, but my sense is that it's just a tiny part of the effort that needs to be done, in that you want to reproduce these efforts in Canada, in Sami, in God knows how many languages, and in Russia, to operate sort of from the common platform of raising awareness amongst all the native peoples, and then getting them to start inputting data into a unified Arctic system. It's just not enough to stay within the boundaries of Alaska. And I'm wondering what you guys are thinking about that. I recognize that there's a resource constraint, but I sense a will constraint too, and that's troublesome. What can we do to bring these efforts more globally to the whole effort?
Great. I think let's take 2 questions at a time.
My name is Joel Coulter. I'm with Honeycomb Networks, but I also represent StarTide's Collaborative Community Resilience Lab at George Mason, and I'm also a member of InfraGard. And we've been spending years and years and years building knowledge bases to try to prepare if we have a blackout for a year, because you know what would happen to the country if we had a blackout. And what I see happening is we spend a lot of time building knowledge in a whole of government approach, but we're not really using the whole of society approach, where we're trying to build, engage the community in innovation and participation, where they're actually taking the lead and making the changes, because the changes are coming. There's nothing you can do to stop a solar flare or stop a flood. The more we can engage the private sector and the community in funding these efforts, the more we will get to what I call the human resilience, not public resilience, but human resiliency at that local level. And you really have to have a private-public partnership. And again, we're engaged in Alaska. I have buoys, and again, it's always good to have situational awareness. But to try to look at this from a top-down change model, as Sam said, it'll take forever, just like it has for trying to prepare for a blackout. How do you think we can prepare the local people to really be innovators and actually produce the solutions for their own change?
This is Karen. For the first question, I participate with Aleutian International Association, one of the permanent participants of the Arctic Council. I feel that the Arctic Council is a wonderful platform to do that cross-boundary work. I'd say that the biggest challenge there is the American agencies and or other nations' respective responsible agencies' willingness to support the project efforts that are proposed there. Very innovative and important work that we as agency folks and as Americans have influence over and could see better used. For the second one, we're looking at, again, that concept of co-production as a way of finding those solutions. But I'd also like to point out that a whole bunch of our rural Alaska resiliency was literally beaten out of us when our children were taken away and our communities were decided by the postmaster, the priest, or the schoolmistress. And these were times where our seasonal lifestyle and our ability to move across the landscape and have portable society is something we need to look back at. Every American, every Alaskan, we still say FEMA should be 3 days, but really in Alaska, 3 weeks is more appropriate if we think back to the impacts that 9/11 had when it disrupted our ability to use aviation. It had a backlog effect that took weeks to recover from. And certainly if it was a pandemic, you know, our communities refusing air service is probably one of our best chances to be healthy in a place where getting treatment is often not an option. So everything old is new again, maybe? Thanks.
So Peter, I'll take yours. I think that there is a real recognition of the international connection, and beyond Arctic Council, we had a very successful Arctic Science Ministerial 2 years ago where we brought 28 countries together. We're going to do another one in October with the EU and Germany where those same countries are getting together. There's already a commitment to do a third ministerial in 2 years from now. So the international community is rallying to this, and you're seeing broad participation. There's twice as many non-Arctic countries participating as there are Arctic countries. So there's a clear recognition that this is a global scale problem, and it's going to take a global scale response to deal with it. Resourcing, I think, will come along with that. If we can get other countries engaged and other countries recognizing not only the opportunities that a changing Arctic is going to present, but the challenges, then I think that's where the resources will start to emerge over some amount of time.
And I think on that note, I'd like to, Sherry, did you have any response that you might want to provide?
Really, I'm Sherry Goodman, and as a global fellow here with the Polar Initiative and the Environmental Change and Security Program, first I just want to thank Elizabeth for organizing this program and thank all of the panelists. I want to thank Jack, our program assistant, for his battlefield promotion introducing this. Did a great job. I'm going to report to your mom. And I want to thank our participants in Alaska. I think the work you do is very important. The co-production of knowledge, the authentic, direct engagement in stakeholder processes is absolutely essential here. I'm very I'm troubled by all the difficulties that are going on in Arctic change, but at the same time, I'm hopeful because efforts like this, the environmental intelligence work that Jeremy's been very much involved with, the gaming work coming out of the educator community and spreading knowledge across a variety of communities, and that Elizabeth, Jack, and many others here at the Wilson Center, across many of the centers here, are really continuing to engage on these efforts to advance them, bring analysis to action in meaningful ways, and not only keep hope alive at a very important time, but develop better practices for the future. So I want to thank you all for being here, and hope that we will continue in our various ways to engage all of you who are here today and also listening on the line.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for bringing us home there, Sherry. And I think on that note, we will close the panel. We'll be available afterwards for questions. Well, Aaron, maybe you have to get to your job.
I am at my job. I am here. I've got more coffee. I'm good. So I'm happy to have people talk to me on the TV or however you guys want to do.
Thank you so very much. And thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.